Welcome. We appreciate your attendance and we're happy to join you today. My name is Alan Phelps. I'm the founder and CEO of IP Talons. And I'm joined today by Dr. Jim Weyemeyer, and we'll do some introductions. But to tee up the conversation, this is part of our webinar series, Protecting America's Critical Supply Chains. And today we're talking about the BIOSECURE Act and the potential implications of that on the biotechnology industry and all the related companies and research organizations that are affiliated with biotechnology in the United States and beyond. And so we're happy to have you join us. And I'll introduce myself, and then I'll allow Dr. Weyemeyer to do the same. Hopefully I got our titles right. But as I mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of IP Talons. Yeah, and more specifically relevant to this audience is I'm also the former head of the Intellectual Property and Trade Secret Protection group at Merck, a large pharmaceutical biotechnology company, multinational company. So I have firsthand experience and knowledge of CROs and CDMOs and CMOs. And so, Jim, I'll let you introduce yourself.
So again, welcome everyone, and just give you a very, a very small or very compact view of what my history has been over time. So I have originally started at the University of Illinois as a faculty member, and then was in New York, was in Atlanta, and now in Auburn. In all of those areas or institutions that were connected with those areas, I served as a vice president for research. And recently decided that 25 years was enough, and decided that I would gradually kind of move out of that space of VP and let somebody else do it for a change. I have again, and I'm delighted that I'm working with IP Talons on their portfolio, which is really pretty extensive. And again, I think absolutely critical in terms of where the academy, the academic institutions need to be at the end of the day as we begin to walk through many of these what appear to be landmines that are out there, and certainly in the biospace, it's an area that I think is just beginning to get the thought and or the thinking as it relates to what the impact could be for this particular piece of legislation, and again, something that I think is critically important.
Great. Well, appreciate that. Appreciate your background, and of course the experience that you have both in academia and then your experience with startups and spinoffs and the biotechnology industry itself is pretty fabulous and relevant to our conversation today. Just as a shout out to those that are joining us today and give you a little more flavor, IP Talons, we're headquartered in Dallas, Texas. Our mission is to protect organizations against primarily insider threats and intellectual property theft by various threat actors around the world, both inside and outside. And our focus has been to really help build the corporate culture around compliance and protecting IP and inventions, to include a lot of emphasis and time that we spend in the biotechnology and helping preserve and protect intellectual property related to not only the research and development pipelines, but also the manufacturing. So in biotechnology, as we all know, a lot of the trade secrets are found and reside within manufacturing, and of course the trade secrets and proprietary information that gets shared with our supply chain partners and our valued external partners like CROs and CMOs and CDMOs are critically important to understand. And so our client base are corporations, research universities, and even government agencies, and we spend a lot of time building a community of trust, if you will. And so I invite you, if you're watching this either live or on the recorded version of this, feel free to take a look at our website and let us know if you have any questions. And so I want to kick off the kind of the agenda, or the give you some main takeaways from the webinar, or at least our discussion, as we hope you would you'll find some relevance and some value add here. The first one, of course, is that the BIOSECURE Act, while it's still going through the congressional reviews and eventually it will be voted on and either passed or not, but what's certainly of interest based on our analysis is that there seems to be bipartisan alignment in the U.S. Congress on protecting America's supply chain, um, and that is definitely the echo or the driving force that we're hearing and that we observed not only in the biotechnology space now with the BIOSECURE Act, but we also saw it with the CHIPS Act and the CHIPS and Science Act that also focus on the American supply chain, in that case related to microelectronics and semiconductors and memory chips and the like. And so we're beginning to see a pattern of bipartisan in the legislative actions that will there's a really good indication that this will become law. And so the first takeaway is that your company will, or your organization will, need to take a look at finding alternatives to high risk, or what's been deemed as high risk external partners, whether that's insourcing it and creating that capability internally, or finding alternative external partners. And we'll talk about the timeline here, but the due date that right now that's been penciled in the BIOSECURE Act is January 1st, 2032. The second key takeaway that I wanted to share was that it's for the first time that I, at least in my experience, that I've seen the focus be on specific companies and organizations that have been named threats to American biotech and biotechnology and the IP and the innovations around that. So what you should take away from that is that your organization, if you have these organizations in your supply chain, what I think the U.S. Congress and by extension the U.S. government as a whole, what they're saying there is that you have confirmed nation-state threats impacting your intellectual property. Not that you didn't know that already, but this is I think a significant step in that the U.S. government through this action is basically announcing that they've identified issues within your supply chain. And so the response to that should be at the executive level, that this is not going to go away. And so it can impact certainly the strings that the U.S. government holds, which would be federal research funding, as well as contracts and grants and the like. And so the BIOSECURE Act is significant in that it's actually beginning to name names, and that's something that we eventually saw with the semiconductor side of the things and the hardware on the related to the CHIPS Act. But so you think of Huawei, for example, and TikTok by extension, although not related to the CHIPS Act. Certainly, there's this trend that the U.S. government has been focusing on specific actors and naming them as part of people's supply chains or somehow threat actors in terms of foreign influence. Jim, I don't know if you have any comments about points 1 or 2, but we have 3 more to go. But I wanted to take a breath there.
I think you did a fabulous job in terms of talking about both of these, and quite honestly, I think that what you'll see as we kind of walk through this the slide deck, there are some important differences that do exist between academic institutions and the corporate structure. But at the end of the day, I think we're all going to be held to a very different level of what we've been held to previously, if indeed all of this does go through Congress. And as Alan had suggested, it looks like it is gaining momentum. It's not stalling at all at the present time. So.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, appreciate that. And that's exactly how I see this as well. Um, and we'll talk about the impact on the supply chain and the external vendors themselves, quite frankly, because I think they're in a position where they where they need to do something to help alleviate some of the concerns, and we can talk about that in a bit. But the focus on countries of concern, and in this case, the BIOSECURE Act seems to be zeroing in on the People's Republic of China, or the Chinese contract research organizations and the contract manufacturing organizations, um, and the realization that those of us that are in the biotechnology industry recognize how prevalent these partners are. And they're in most American biotech company supply chains or research organizations at all sizes. So you have the big companies, the big biopharmaceutical companies, as well as the startups that rely on external partners to do a lot of the regulatory or the scale up or whatever that work may be. And so your organization should, one of the recommendations of that is, do you actually have this risk in your environment, and so or in your supply chain? So most of us would, if you're involved, you would readily recognize some of the names that are outlined in the BIOSECURE Act. But certainly your company should conduct a risk assessment to determine the direct and indirect exposure. And the key term here is the indirect. Because we recognize that a lot of these larger CROs and CMOs have tentacles, if you will. So they either have investments in other companies, or they have subsidiaries doing the work on behalf of the parent company. And so one of the things that we'll have to really keep an eye on, and that's why I asked you to join the IP Talents community, because one of the things that we do is we kind of track the regulatory environment and the legislative actions to see how far those tentacles and how far the security controls and the compliance requirements are going to go. And so if it's just naming the parent company, does that then flow down through the supply chain or the related companies or organizations to those main partners? But conducting a risk assessment to determine what that exposure is critically important, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, or certainly can give you some advice on how to do that. The fourth main key here, and as a security professional, I can tell you that we're always thinking about worst case scenarios and thinking about contingency plans and what could actually disrupt our company and our operations. And now more than ever in our past, geopolitical and global economic security issues are now, I wouldn't say disrupting, but certainly are adding complexity to our planning. So one of the things that we highly recommend is that your organization, when you think about business continuity and crisis management, you have to now inject geopolitical and global economic security issues into that planning. And so I envision in the very near future, biotechnology companies and pharmaceutical companies in the industry as a whole we should start seeing tabletop exercises to say, what if there's a disruption in my supply chain, whether it's man-made via a political action or some sort of war breaks out. Certainly, we try to do this in supply chain security when we think about natural disasters, such as a tsunami, for example, that could take out a sugarcane field somewhere in the world. Now we have to address the geopolitical and global economic concerns as well. And so as you think about crisis management and business continuity, these are issues like this BIOSECURE Act is something you have to have on your radar and plan accordingly for. And then finally, I just wanted to share this. And again, this is a personal, professional look at this. I don't have any insights into what may be coming down the pipe here, but I would assume, based on what we've seen in the Chips and Science Act and now the BIOSECURE Act, is that there definitely is a high probability that other critical technology sectors should experience the same level of scrutiny and oversight and action from the regulators or in this case the U.S. Congress itself. And so primarily because the critical technology is so tied to the American national interest, both the economic interest as well as the national security interest. Um, there seems to be a push for the U.S. government to be more involved in protecting those assets, even though a lot of the supply chains or most of the supply chains involve private sector companies, public research organizations like universities. Certainly, there's this idea that this could be expanding to other critical technologies. So you think of we've seen it in semiconductors, and now we see it in biotech. It would not surprise me to see it in energy, alternate energy, solar, wind, that sort of thing, oil, gas, and then ultimately the critical infrastructure itself. So transmissions, power grid, all the vulnerabilities that you would see that would have a national impact would likely be in scope now for this. And so I'll take a pause there. Jim, any final comments before we move on?
I think one of the things, at least in my experience, and I was in Atlanta actually working between Georgia State, Georgia Tech, and Emory. And there, again, a pretty significant portfolio of, again, intellectual property that was largely targeting therapeutics, but there were other things that were part of that as well. I think one of the things that ultimately did trigger China being, clearly in the crosshairs on this is when they did, in essence, put in place what we call the FDA, they called it CDA, and there was nothing there prior to them essentially elevating or bringing that particular capacity on board. That made, again, for a lot of reasons, a lot of infrastructure that was built in China to, in essence, do exactly what Alan was talking about. And I think it makes it very challenging for where we fit in all of that. But again, it's something that I think we'll talk a bit more about shortly.
Excellent. Yep. Thanks. Yeah, appreciate that. So, obviously, most of us on the call have read, or if not all of us, have read the BIOSECURE Act, and of course, it's been changing over the past few months. But one of the remarkable things, is how quickly this bill is actually moving. And so we wanted to pull out some bulleted highlights, basically, what we pulled out of the document itself, and then some industry analysts that provided some of their notes. But just to give you a sense of how quickly this is moving, so this popped up in January of this year, 2024. Couple of representatives, again, bipartisan, and the idea here is that they introduced the BIOSECURE Act under the guise of making sure that foreign adversarial biotech companies did not have access to taxpayer dollars. And again, we saw this in the Chips and Science Act as well, is that the leverage that the U.S. Congress has and the legislature has over private companies and even public sector is this financial interest and financial stewardship over the U.S. taxpayer dollar. And so the initial bill named 4 companies of concern: WuXi AppTec, BGI, Complete Genomics, and an MGI. And as I mentioned it, in the 5 takeaways, is that clearly there's concern on these companies, and whatever the connection is. Of course, we never are privy to the intelligence that might be driving some of this, but certainly the idea here is that for the fact that they named companies in a bill seems to be unique, right? At least to me, that's what struck me. The first at first was this idea that there are 4 companies. Now it's expanded to WuXi Biologics, and so that was in January, and then in May they expanded it, and they did a couple things just recently. On the 15th, they established a 2032 deadline for U.S. Biotech companies to cut ties with those companies, and so from a supply chain resilience or a supply chain continuity standpoint, while that seems like a lot of time, it really isn't, considering how big a role the Chinese CROs and CDMOs and CMOs play in American biotechnology. And so it's a really big deal, and it's one that outside the industry I don't think has gotten much press, or at least maybe in the things that I read, I haven't seen it. But the there's now a deadline, and so deadlines do a couple things. Either you wait and see to see if it goes away, or you start doing something now to to be in compliance. And so that is this bill is a pretty heavy hitter when it comes to enforcement. And so and again, it called out this idea of that there's companies of concern, and we'll share with you in the next slide about where that the terminology comes from. It's pretty interesting. This idea of things of concern that are driving a lot of these decisions, I think are pretty interesting. And then it gets very specific into who, what gets banned, and when you can. So can you extend or renew or not renew? And again, it's very specific to those 5 companies. And so it's something to pay attention to, especially when if you're in supply chain or supply chain security or in contracts. You really have to understand the impact and keep on top of what this actually means for those renewals. In a lot of cases, these agreements auto renew, and so there's some implications there to go take a look at to see what that exposure is. And so again, going back to this idea of doing a due diligence or a risk assessment on your supply chain to determine, do you have a direct or indirect exposure to this? Because you might be relying on a supplier that might be U.S. Domiciled, but then they have turned around and subbed it out to a country or a company that might be on that list. And so you really have to have visibility and confidence that you know where all your ingredients and all your partners and their partners are sourced from. And then again, there is a grandfather clause that kind of kicks the can, although there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done just to find those alternative sources, right? And it is not easy to do given the size and scope of these foreign partners in the work that they're doing, and the importance of the work that they're doing in the supply chains for the U.S. And again, this idea that I was really surprised how quickly this has transpired, right? And so in a big wake up call for me was to see the biotechnology industry organization, the BIO as we all refer to it. I was kind of shocked to see the split between Wuxi EpTech and BIO. They had been, at least from my perspective, very good partners promoting biotechnology in the industry in general, and certainly as an exhibitor at BIO for many years. These are name brand companies that you would see either on the expo floor, or at least certainly you were aware of them. And so to see them to have this kind of split and this divorce from BIO was pretty interesting. And again, the issue came from how serious the U.S. government is, at least the U.S. Congress is, in protecting this particular supply chain. And then I found it noteworthy that companies have been pretty vocal as well as in their response to say this is there's a significant potential impact to this, right? And so a lot of our supply chains, a lot of our manufacturing strategies, a lot of our how we actually bring a drug to market relies on the partnership and the trust that we have with CROs, CDMOs, and CMOs from all over the world, including the ones that were listed in this particular act. And so this is a major deal, certainly in the biotech industry. And it's I would, as I mentioned before, I think it should be a word of caution for other companies that are in critical technology sectors, because if I can imagine this time next year having the same conversation about another critical technology industry that's affecting that has to deal with the same sort of concerns. And so the fact that Merck in its SEC filing basically said this could have significant disruptions, and so the way you read that, if you're not a finance person, the way you read that is they're already calling out potential impact on their product development life cycle, sales, of course, business, cash flow, And so they're putting the analysts on notice, quite frankly, to say, hey, this is a big deal, right? And so if you didn't get the memo on the BIOSECURE Act, when you see Merck and some of the other large companies in this space make statements like this, it's a significant development on the regulatory side of things. So with that, I'll take a pause. Jim, any comments or thoughts on the highlights of the
No, I think this is good.
Okay, sounds good. So I just wanted to call out because IP Talents has been in the research security and the insider threat space for a long time. What caught my attention was this idea of companies of concern. Um, and if you weren't in the business or if you weren't tracking research security, you might have missed the fact that there's now this growing use of the word concern. And so countries concern is something that popped up to identify China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea primarily, and then depending on some of the export control issues, other countries, but certainly the four countries of concern, and you'll find this in guidelines, federal regulations, and now laws and statutes. This idea of countries concerned, and so, for example, the NSPM 33, which is the National Security Memorandum on number 33 on research security, published by the White House's Office of Science and Technology, or policy, OSTP for short. That provided the research security guidelines, and the CHIPS Act did the same thing, right? So what made the NSPM 33 law was the lines in the CHIPS Act that said you have to comply with NSPM 33. The reason I mention that is that both of them talk about the country's concern. The National Defense Authorization Act, the Department of Defense, the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, they all have language in either their terms and conditions of their contracts or their grant applications that talk about countries of concern. And so for the first time, at least it was new to me, I had seen the term companies of concern, which was pretty, in my mind, it's a departure from just being a generic kind of highlighting a region or a particular country. Now they're actually getting very specific into what they see as threat actors, and it's something to pay attention to. But as we mentioned, it's all Chinese companies at this point. I could easily see this as intelligence expands into other areas of critical technologies and further into biotechnology. You could actually see additional companies being added to this, and so transparency of your supply chain, knowing exactly where you get your raw materials from, where you get your excipients, understanding who you partner with to do various things within your manufacturing process or your R&D processes is going to be critically important, because what you'll have to understand from a crisis management and a business continuity is to know when you actually have a potential risk coming out of the geopolitical or the economic interest realm now, right? So it's one thing to understand your supply chain if there's a big storm or some sort of man-made, or there's a war somewhere, understanding how that impacts your supply chain. But now you have to understand who's actually in your supply chain and who's working on your behalf, or working for those that are working for you. And so to me, it was a game changer. But this idea of concern in the wording is something that that I believe will continue to see expand. So with that, I'll just give you a quick timeline. One of the things that will catch a lot of us, caught me off guard, and certainly probably a lot of you, especially those of you that are calling in from government affairs or regulatory functions within the biotech industry, is how quickly this thing has moved. And again, I just wanted to have a graphic or a visual to show you what this looks like. So, basically it started in 2024 as this identify, we got to protect the taxpayer dollars from going to what was deemed as of companies concerned. And then in March it expanded, it added another aspect to this, because we saw the splintering between kind of partners that were very friendly. In this case, Bio and Wuxi Abtec, they parted way. And I don't have any insights to this, but I have to assume that Wuxi Abtec was concerned about Bio's either response to the legislation or the lack of, right? And so I'm not sure, I'm not sure what the inside baseball was, but it was enough for those two entities to part ways. And then of course the Senate Homeland Security Committee advanced a counterpart bill in the Senate. So now you have you now have legislation that is basically fast tracked. The House and the Senate are working in parallel to get this to signature. And again, I haven't seen a timeline, but I think we're getting very close to a vote, right? And so you would have to assume that this thing is going to pass, barring some sort of major interception by an entity around the concerns of what this means to patients, or maybe our own availability of drugs or biotherapies in the market. But in May of 2024, again, the WuXi Biologics was added to the companies concerned list, and then the Congress received the what I would describe as impact statements, if you will, from U.S. companies or companies that are impacted by the BIOSECURE Act, and then the bio itself. In part, that was partly from the survey that I believe Bio sponsored, or had somebody do that survey for them, or with them, and so the feedback was that we need more time to deal with this, and so so the Congress agreed to phase in, if you will, for lack of better terms, the enforcement of this, and so. So now between May and 2032, now we have what I call the phase response phase, right? So how do you, or timeline, you have some years here to figure out how to detangle or decouple yourself from those companies. And so it's easier said than done. I can appreciate that as somebody that's worked supply chain security issues. It's a very complex and integrated process, primarily because, as we all know, this is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the world, right? And so when you partner up with a company, all those processes and transactions are reviewed and approved and documented, and then the health authorities basically stamp it approved. And so when you make changes, whether it is to a formula or to a process, a manufacturing process, all that has to be reviewed. And so if you're going to do it's not as simple as just switching on a vendor. You actually then have to revalidate, or validate the new process and the new vendor and the new facilities. And so it's a very really big, and I would argue a very expensive way to way forward here. And so because with change comes a lot of planning, a lot of due diligence, a lot of vetting, and then ultimately you have to basically get your processes approved again. And so January 31st, 2031 is that kind of looming date that we all should have on our calendars. While it seems like it's a long time, that is going to go by very fast. And so you probably need to start doing things like risk assessments today, if not next week, or very short order here, to understand how big of issue this is for your particular company or your organization, and to make sure that you're not jumping in and out of the frying pan into the fire, right? So understanding how things are connected is critically important. So, Jim, any thoughts, comments on the timeline before we move on?
So the timeline, I think you're right. It's very specific, and my guess is once this starts, it will go all the way to the end, and I think for good reason. One of the things, Alan, that at least in the last couple of slides, that I would somewhere thread into this is workforce. Mm-hmm. Which again becomes very problematic, and especially when you look at pharma as an example. But there are many examples of where we do not have the workforce available to essentially internalize this and to begin to do something that ultimately is going to now recapture what we gave away to so many different countries not that long ago. And I think, particularly on the health side, and particularly as it relates to therapeutics that again are being generated elsewhere. One of the other things that needs to essentially be in the thought process is how you're going to essentially accomplish or put the workforce in place that's going to, in essence, now backfill what has not been there for a number of years. So
that's a great, yeah, that's a great point, and it. My assumption is that the research universities that are in healthcare, that are doing clinical trials, and maybe have the research parks or the research facilities. I know Auburn has innovation hubs and universities around the country, and of course private sector research parks and tech centers and offices of economic development at the state level. My assumption would be that they're all hands on deck at this point to address this particular need, right? So there's not a, so you highlighted the critical component of talent. Who's actually going to do this work? If it's not outsourced to China, who can actually do that work? And is it going to be outsourced to an entity that's going to end up on the no-fly list themselves, right? And so the idea here is that can you find when you make these massive, expensive changes, you want to be very thoughtful in where that work is done next, so you don't have to repeat this process, next year or the year after that. And so the idea of the talent and then the facilities, right? And so somebody that's gone to trusted external partners and seeing these facilities firsthand, these are state-of-the-art, FDA approved, CDA approved facilities. So it's not just, it's not as easy just swapping out a vendor. You actually have to find somebody that's qualified to run your processes, that are dependable and can follow the instructions every single time, so that you get the same product and it meets the compliance requirements, but also has the investment made in the facilities, right? And so, as we all know in biotech, these are very expensive facilities, and things like fermentation processes. It's a very regulated and controlled environment. So that's a great point. So in addition to the talent, I would echo that the facilities are going to be in high demand as well. So one of the things I did appreciate about the survey, and I hope I got this right, but just recently the survey results came out. I gave credit to the bio organization. If there was somebody else that I missed, I'll track that down. But what was interesting was that how much of our biotechnology industry is involved in this, right? And so it's not just scaling up your biomatter. It's in some cases, in a lot of cases, it's preclinical. It's actual research and development. Every phase of the biotechnology and the bioproduct production is involved or in scope of this BIOSECURE Act. And so one of the things that the survey provided was this idea of the R&D, the production, the raw materials, the assessments, the safety protocols, and the testing of that, and the documentation of that, and then of course the chemical characterization and the cell line growth and all that stuff that goes into biotechnology. It's a really big, complex supply chain here, and so. Some of the statistics that came out of that that were clearly impactful on the U.S. Congressional decision to extend out that due date at least out to 2032 was how many people were, or how many research organizations and manufacturers in the United States would be impacted or are impacted by this, right? And so what I just kind of pulled on some of the highlights. So 85% of the survey respondents indicated that changing a vendor, swapping out like a WuXi AppTech or a WuXi Biologics, for example, could take anywhere from 6 months to 6 years to replace, detangle, and redo. And so that's a significant timeline. And then and of course, the other statistics were related to how many marketed products would have impact on this. And so that's where the supply chain and the meeting the needs of the patients both now and tomorrow comes into play, because they absolutely are part of this conversation. And so, if 52% of the survey respondents said that this impacts their marketed products, if there's a 2 to 8 year window there, that's a really long transition period, right? And from a company and a professional, security professional that protects industry trade secrets and knowledge assets, that is a long time to do a transition, right? And so there will be, whenever you have a period of transition, it's almost guaranteed that you'll see an increase in the theft of or misappropriation of a trade secret. And so it's something that companies really need to pay attention to. So not only do you have to have a business committee, or I would even call it maybe not a crisis team, but certainly a transition team here to say, okay, how are we going to make this pivot? Included in that has to be a security plan. How are we going to do this securely? How are we going to not only decouple the operations, but how are we going to make sure that the data that we have sitting all around the world actually comes back to us, or is disposed of properly? And so there's a lot of facets that involve research security, supply chain security, and certainly in our line of business, we do all of that, but also this idea of protecting the trade secret, and knowing who knows what and how much have you shared with outside trusted external partners that may go away, or does that in itself, does this decoupling actually present an increased threat to your intellectual property? I would argue it absolutely does, if it hasn't already, right? And so briefing and training your individuals that are working not only on the transition plan, but also working the day-to-day. Because if you've ever swapped out an external partner, it gets really weird, to put it oddly, mildly, is that when you're going with a new vendor, but you're working with the original vendor, there's some weird interpersonal stuff that happens there. And so one of the recommendation of that is that conduct that risk assessment to include the impact on your trade secrets. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as time allows, but just I wanted to throw that out there. And then, as Jim mentioned, finding the people to do the work. So if you've built your entire operation on relying on outsourced trusted external partners, how do you find a replacement for that? Do you bring it back to research universities, and is there due diligence in place to make sure that you're not just handing over the trade secret to somebody that may not have been trained on how to protect trade secrets? And so we do a lot of work with research universities. We do a lot of work with research parks and innovation hubs to make sure that the owner of that trade secret, or that biotechnology manufacturing process, has the comfort and assurance that who you're handing this work to actually knows how to protect it. And of course, as we already mentioned, there's regulatory approvals. This is a very expensive endeavor to move away from an existing supply chain to a new supply chain. So really something to pay attention to. And as I mentioned before, Merck has already said, hey, this is going to be a very long process, and an expensive one at that. Any comments there, Jim, before I move on to?
So very, very quickly, but when I think about it, it clearly, the infrastructure is a very significant piece of what's needed going forward. But I wonder, whether the capacity of the health area is really up to speed with really understanding what the potential problems would be in terms of trying to transition relatively quickly. I mean, even 6 or 8 years, that's fast.
Mm-hmm.
Compared to what it has been for all of time. I mean, it has. We've never tried to do this in the health area. It's always been, to the best of my knowledge, always been trying to be so pragmatic, so in essence focused on what's going on, and you don't do the experiment once or twice or 3 times. You do it as many times as you need to be able to, prove the FDA or whatever the agency is that we have this locked, and we know how to, in essence, manage this particular disease process. I think the health infrastructure itself, when you look at it in a holistic way, will be very challenged by something like this.
That is a wonderful point. One of the things that I predict that we'll see out of this is this emergence of artificial intelligence
Yep.
and can this force a sea change in the on the regulatory side to say, okay, do we, how many experience live physical experiments need to be done, or can some of that be modeled in a supercomputer, and can we crunch the data to a reliability standpoint where you don't need to do so many repetitive
Right.
physical tests, for example, and so I think, if there is a silver lining in this, it might be the infusion of looking at different ways to do this, assuming that the outcomes, of course, we all care about, the number one priority is patient safety and making sure that we're doing things the right way. But if we can shorten that life cycle, that might be a welcome response. And I will just share, the semiconductor industry. It literally had the same conversation, 5 years ago, and with the Chips and Science Act that kind of came out with this. What you should take away if you're in the biotechnology industry is that the U.S. government has now funded almost $100 billion to kind of crank up the capability, to replace this
Yeah.
supply chain. So not that there's an open checkbook, but I think when you introduce this type of sea change in a supply chain, if you will, that it has to come with dollars and innovation, right, or dollars to promote that innovation, so that we can actually, if we're going to be serious about national security and that's the driving force behind some of these changes, then the investments and the innovation has to come with it. So. But yeah, thanks, Jim, for that.
Mhm.
What also caught my eagle eye in the bill was this reference to the first step, right? And so, so this idea of our supply chains must break free from foreign adversaries, however you want to define that. As a security and a compliance control person, I don't see that. I think everything can be managed if you have the right people and the right processes and the right technologies in place. But set that aside. What was interesting about this BIOSECURE Act and some of the comments around this was that it was mentioned as a first step. And then whatever this multifaceted approach is to protect the U.S. national health security, multifaceted usually means something else is coming, right? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but you should expect in your regulatory and your regulatory affairs and your kind of your DC representatives need to keep their eyes and ears on Washington to see what else might be coming down,
Yeah.
and certainly we will do that too, right? We try to keep a pulse on what's happening so that we can help our clients and our prospects kind of pivot and be prepared for what's coming next. I know we're coming up. We have about 10 minutes left, so I just wanted to kind of highlight what that was pulled onto that survey. So they did include the potential impact on patients, and I thought it was interesting that when asked to assess the disruption in services provided by, in this case, the Chinese CDMOs, for the approved medicines that are actually on the market, 18% of the respondents said that about 500,000 patients could be impacted by this, and then as additional statistics, right around 500,000 people, patients that could be directly impacted by a disruption of the supply chain. And again, like you mentioned, Jim, 6 to 8 years to do something is rapid fast, and so keeping an eye on the impact on patients is certainly would be. I know Congress is certainly aware of that, and then organizations like BIO and of course the industry and members itself are paying attention to this. I do want to, so Wuxi Eptech and other companies that were called out in this bill have been coming out and have been trying to address, obviously, this disrupts their operations significantly, and they're fielding a lot of questions, quite frankly, from U.S. industry to say, what do we do, right? And so, so early on, when the bill was introduced, WSHI Tech said, hey, we have processes in place. We trust our folks. There might have been maybe an affiliation that was maybe miscategorized, um, but our advice to companies like WuXi AppTech and WuXi Biologics and BGI is that obviously you want to respond directly to what's happening in your operation, but there are things like insider threat programs. There are things like research security practices that prime contractors like WuXi AppTech can actually then implement, right? And so in my mind, this is an entire supply chain response, right? So it's one thing that the U.S. companies will have to pivot, but also the vendors that are called out, just not only currently but in the future in other critical technology sectors. You really have to think about what you can do as a company to help reassure and actually take proactive measures to protect customer information, client data, trade secrets that you have custody of. There are things that you can do, and there's always improvement, right? And so one of the things that we highly recommend as biotech companies are engaging WuXi AppTech and BGI and WuXi Biologics is to say, especially in this transition period of the next 10 years, for example, what can we do together to secure the supply chain, to implement research security practices, and to make those investments so that there might be a change of hearts and minds if you can demonstrate that you can actually protect customer data and national security interests. You might actually have the ability to kind of sway some of these other decisions. This idea of just we're just going to not accept it may not be the best response, and certainly as we see this in the other critical technology sectors, how you respond to this. Unfortunately, I think this caught everybody off guard. I would imagine WuXi AppTech was caught off guard as well. I don't think anybody saw this coming. So the idea here is that if you're in another critical technology sector, you've got to pay attention to this to say, okay, we have to assume this is going to happen to us. And so if I'm an artificial intelligence equivalent to WuXi AppTech, how am I going to respond to this? How am I going to reassure my customers and my clients, and then ultimately the U.S. Other U.S. stakeholders that we can actually protect this? The question that I have, because we map out supply chains for a living, right? We try to figure out who's connected to whom, and from the researcher all the way to the people financing startups and the like. And so when you connect the dots, you got to say, okay, there are 5 companies listed, but will that extend to, how far out does that extend? And I talked about that tentacle issue that might apply here. And so WuXi AppTech is a fabulously successful company, right? And I know the senior leadership there. I've worked with them for many years, and they've done very well. Obviously, they're a very large, established company, and they've made their own investments. And so the idea is then, okay, will this then impact those investments, right? And so when you think about your own supply chain, so it's one thing to say, okay, I don't have WuXi AppTech in my supply chain, but I might have something that they're invested in. So the question is, how far do the dots get connected, and will that impact? Will the BIOSECURE Act connect to these companies as well, right? And so, and again, we're not investors. But we do look at investment portfolios to say, okay, you need to. There is a trickle down effect here. And so each one of these companies probably needs to have a research security program to specifically address supply chain concerns, right? And so it's everybody's connected to everyone else. And so this idea of that you got to start infusing good security controls and compliance controls so that when a question does arise, that you actually have an answer. And so, just speaking on behalf of IP Talents, we help you come up with that answer. That's not just words, but it's actually legitimate, tangible, auditable security controls that you can actually point to and say, okay, we actually are reducing and managing this risk proactively. So As we come up to the top of the hour here, I appreciate you hanging with us. There are some recommendations that we would make as security practitioners, focus on supply chain security. Um, I would, if you haven't already done it, you probably need to assemble an internal team to say let's pull a team together and let's conduct that a risk assessment to identify exposures. And again, it's not just the direct. It's not just going to procurement and saying do we have Wuxi, Eptech, or BGI in our supply chain. You want to say, okay, let's figure out where we're exposed. Let's get a list of of all of our suppliers and their suppliers and see, what kind of exposure that we might have here. If you don't have one, you got to get one, and that is a research security program. I can't emphasize this enough. This is not a sales pitch. This is just really smart practice to do right now. Is that if this is not a wake up call to your biotech company, I don't know what will be. But a research security program would help you identify these things that are coming down in the future, so you can navigate around it, right? And so there's nothing worse than a crisis. Crisis, when you have a crisis management issue, that is a very expensive thing to deal with. But the better investment, quite frankly, is a research security program that connects with your supply chain security, connects with your R&D management. It addresses your pipeline security issues, and it builds this fabric of awareness and transparency, and you train all of your staff to manage these risks, and then developing a management around the remediation of this risk. Start working on your I say external partners here. If you I suspect if you had the ability to do it internally, you would have done that already. But there are, I assume there's going to be an emergence of approved, if you will, external partners, or at least the ones that are not on the list. And hopefully the ones on the list can actually kind of course correct as well. But the idea is that you have a relatively short window here to find alternatives to your manufacturing and your R&D processes, and all the other components that were identified in that survey. One of the biggest things that as a trade secret protection professional, one of the things I cannot stress enough, and I stress it to everyone that I talk to, is know where your trade secrets are, know who touches it, who has access to it, and then make sure that they know how to properly handle and treat those trade secrets as trade secrets, and then continuously conduct risk assessments. We recommend an annual risk assessment to identify vulnerabilities. And so, because if you don't know where your assets are, or who touches that, it's almost impossible, if not absolutely impossible, to protect those. The fifth recommendation is to have a remediation plan. We recommend this in having a research pipeline rather, and your insider risk management practices. So your trade secrets, you have to have a plan to protect your trade secrets, and nothing like the BIOSECURE Act to say, okay, maybe next time, maybe we don't share all of our trade secrets with a CRO. Maybe we start splitting this up between vendors and in locations, both geographic and political, and so that you can balance out the risk to say, okay, if something goes up in smoke, at least we don't have a catastrophic need to pivot to something else. But the only way you can get there is if you actually have a remediation plan related to your trade secrets, or whatever makes you competitive in the market. Leverage outside expertise to manage your foreign influence and your nation state risk. That doesn't mean calling in, federal or state law enforcement, but there are companies out there that can actually help you navigate foreign influence and nation state risk. Again, part of your contingency planning, your supply chain risk planning, and your crisis management and your business continuity plans. They now have to include a tabletop exercise and a plan around what happens if we are a victim of a foreign influence or a nation state attack. Would we know it? Would we know what it looked like if we had one? And do we have the right people in place to actually deal with it? And so that's a discussion around technology, around surveillance, and like. And so, and again, engage partners to conduct supply chain due diligence and risk assessments. You don't want to jump out of the frying pan just to find yourself in the same problem down the road. And then you want to update your, as I mentioned, your crisis management, your business continuity plans. So with that, I don't know how many of you are coming out to BIO. We exhibit there, as I mentioned. We try to go every year. Certainly the pandemic kind of threw that for a loop, but certainly we're at booth 4254. We put it by the food court. We assume you're hungry, so come by as you wait for your sandwich, your $50 bologna and cheese. Come by and have a conversation with us. We are a member of the 101 partnering program, so you can hit us up. We can schedule some time, and at any time, day or night, I'm willing to have a confidential discussion with you. So feel free to schedule with us either in person at Bio or offline or online anytime. Besides that, and with that, again, here's another link to our website. And Jim, any final thoughts? I know we're at the hour now. So.
No, I think you did a great job. So and appreciate the folks that have been on the call.
All right, thanks. Have a great day, everyone. Appreciate it.